All right, well, hello everyone. I'm sure most of you already know me. You've probably sat in on some of my other presentations, but if not, my name is Jean Messier. I used to be a mechanical engineer, but I got out of that. I now make my living writing. So I write scripts for the YouTube channel Today I Found Out, as well as for my own YouTube channel, which is called Our Own Devices, where I look at vintage technology. And I'm currently actually completing a 3-month technical writing term with the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada. So when the museum opens up, hopefully early next year, a lot of the panels and labels for the aircraft and the artifacts will be written by yours truly. So I'm joined on this presentation by Dr. James Poplow. James, why don't you unmute your mic and introduce yourself?
I am an aerospace medicine physician. I trained in our own training and in Medical School of Queens and in Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. But there were no real flight surgeons in 1930 to 1940, just before the war. They were only in the military. The people who took up the problem of acceleration and G, which Crile is going to talk about, were really physiologists and physicians on the outside. But my claim to fame, aside from being in the Air Force for 31 years, I did serve as Director of Medical Life Support Division in a place called Defense and Civil Institute of Environmental Medicine in Toronto, DCIM, from 84 to 88. And you will discover that Dr. Franks died in 1986. I did get to know him then. I worked with him just a little bit, although goodness knows he was aging. We went to aerospace medicine meetings together, and I feel very close to the subject. So I will reserve now until the end of the talk and answer any medical questions if any should pop up. And Gilles, thank you for doing all of the work to set up these slides.
Oh, you're very welcome. All right, thank you, James. All right, so before we move on, just a little note. A lot of sources tend to give Dr. Franks sole credit for inventing the G-suit. These tend to be very patriotic lists of Canadian innovations. As you'll see, this is not quite the case. Like a lot of different inventions, say the airplane itself, the G-suit was really too necessary and too good of an idea to have been invented by any one single person at any one point in time. And so we're going to be looking at not only Dr. Franks's work, but also the work before and after him that led to the development of the modern G-suit. And as we'll also see, unfortunately, the particular line of inquiry that Dr. Franks pursued turned out to be something of a technological dead end, but it was vital nonetheless, and he was still the first person to design a G-suit that was tested in combat. Anyway, let's get started. So the problem that the G-suit is meant to address is the problem of G-Induced Loss of Consciousness, or G-LOC, and this is the phenomenon of pilots blacking out during high acceleration maneuvers. And this problem really came to the fore during the First World War, and especially into the 1920s and 1930s as aircraft became increasingly faster and more maneuverable. And this occurred to pilots in a wide variety of situations, especially pulling out of dives or during high-speed turns. It was especially a problem for the nascent dive bomber forces. And the root of the problem can be explained in a number of different ways. You can describe it as the effects of centripetal and centrifugal force upon a rotating object, but the way I like to explain it is with inertia. So one of Newton's laws, of course, an object in motion will stay in motion unless a force stops it. Object at rest will stay at rest unless a force moves it. If you're in an aircraft diving, as in this illustration here, the aircraft, your body, and the blood inside your body is going to want to move in that straight line. It's not going to want to deviate from that course. So as you start pulling out of the dive, your body still wants to go in that straight line, but is prevented from doing so by the body of the aircraft. So your body exerts a force upon the aircraft, and this creates a lot of physiological effects that we'll be looking at just in a minute. Now, before we move on, a little note on sign conventions. So traditionally, if G-force is applied towards the feet, as it would be when you're just standing on the ground, that's considered to be positive G. If it's directed towards the head, that's known as negative G. And there are also transverse directions that the force can be applied across or through the chest. But in most cases, the physiological effects of that are not nearly as dramatic as in the longitudinal direction, though pilots do have colorful terms for these if the force is applied behind you towards the rear, that's considered to be eyeballs in. If it's directed forward, then that's eyeballs out for obvious reasons. So what actually occurs during G-LOC? Here we have a diagram. We have an unfortunate test subject in a centrifuge, actually Dr. Franks' centrifuge in Toronto. So in the first one, you can see the circulatory system. And in the circulatory system, oxygenated blood is taken by the heart from the lungs and then pumped to the rest of the body, including the brain. When the oxygen is exchanged from the blood is then passed into the venous system and then returned to the heart. The problem is the venous system is relatively low pressure compared to the arterial system, and thus is very sensitive to high acceleration loads. So the heart is actually powerful enough to pump blood against pretty high accelerations, but this ability doesn't mean anything if there's no blood to pump. So under high accelerations, as you can see in the second diagram there, this overcomes the low pressure of the venous system, and blood tends to pool in the veins in the lower extremities, in the legs, and in the abdomen. And at high enough G loads, the heart essentially becomes starved of blood, and it really has nothing to pump to the brain. And so the brain becomes starved of oxygen, and the person passes out. Now, people's tolerance to G forces really varies. Some people can take quite a lot of G, some people can't take hardly any at all. It really varies, but generally speaking, this is the progression for G-induced loss of consciousness. At around 3 to 4 G, you start to lose your vision. You'll get tunnel vision as peripheral vision is lost, and then you'll have a complete blackout. But you're not going to pass out immediately unless you're very sensitive to G. The next symptom some people will experience is a loss of hearing. Sounds will become very distant and muffled, but most people don't actually remember that because this is immediately preceded by total loss of consciousness, like the unfortunate fellow at the end there, as the brain becomes completely deprived of oxygen and consciousness is completely lost. Again, different for different people, but this is the general progression. Now, the loss of sight that precedes G-LOC actually isn't due to lack of blood to the brain, but rather lack of blood to the eyeball itself. So an artery supplies blood via very fine capillaries to the retina of the eye, and the inside of the eye is filled with a clear liquid called the vitreous humor. Now, under acceleration, the humor becomes compressed, and this pushes against the capillaries and cuts them off, and thus cuts off blood flow to the retina. Retina is deprived of oxygen, and the person loses their sight. Whereas the loss of hearing and loss of consciousness are caused by lack of blood to the brain. So, very brief description of what happens during G-LOC. I'm sure that James will be able to fill us in on some of the finer details when we go to the Q&A. So interestingly enough, a lot of the physiological research and a lot of the technical developments that would lead to the modern G-suit, which is meant to delay the onset of G-LOC, actually took place before there was even such a thing as heavier than air aviation. And one of the first people to develop what we might call a G-suit was a surgeon named Dr. George W. Crile. And he was concerned not so much with protecting pilots from blacking out. After all, other than balloon pilots, there really were no pilots. This is before 1903. But rather with maintaining patients' blood pressure while they were undergoing surgery. And so what he developed was this suit that you can see here that covered the patient's legs and abdomen and arms, and this could be inflated either with air or filled with water. And this compressed the patient's extremities and forced blood back to the core, maintaining their blood pressure during surgery. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a rather cumbersome device to use. Dr. Crile really didn't use it all that much. It wasn't adopted more widely in surgery, and he eventually abandoned the idea. But interestingly enough, later on in the 1930s, shortly before he died, Dr. Crile was in a military aircraft that ran into some pretty extreme turbulence, and he watched as the crew around him started passing out from the extreme G loads and became very concerned with this problem and actually provided advice and mentorship to a lot of the other pioneers in the development of the G-suit. So he was very much a man ahead of his time. Now, the problem of G-LOC in pilots became apparent during the First World War and was first described in a medical journal by Sir Henry Head, who was a very famous British physiologist. And he called it fainting in the air. The problem was it was very difficult for doctors at the time to study this phenomenon because the pilots weren't talking. The pilots didn't recognize that this was a perfectly normal physiological response, and they were embarrassed. They, had this machismo where they didn't want to appear to be weak. And so they never talked about it, and they just went about the business of figuring out how to deal with it themselves. And so you can see how that would make it very difficult to study because the ones who'd figured out what was going on weren't talking, and the ones who didn't, well, they were all dead. And at around this time, this revelation about fainting in the air, about G-LOC, led to a bit of a paradigm shift in aircraft design, because up until this point, aircraft designers had been making aircraft increasingly fast, increasingly maneuverable, and the structure of the aircraft itself stronger and stronger to put up with these increasing forces. But as you can see in this extract from a letter by United States Army Air Force flight surgeon Ira F. Peake, they soon realized that they were reaching diminishing returns because at a certain point, it didn't matter how strong you made the aircraft, the component that was going to fail first was the pilot. So they'd really reached this upper limit to aircraft maneuverability and performance where they couldn't go any higher unless some method could be found to make pilots more resilient to G-forces. Now, the first person to investigate the phenomenon of G-LOC in a systematic way was Dr. Harry G. Armstrong, who is considered to be the father of aerospace medicine. And you've probably heard him by the Armstrong line, which he discovered. And this is the altitude above which the survival of an unprotected human is impossible because the pressure is so low that the moisture in your lungs starts to bubble away and evaporate, and it makes breathing impossible. Now, he was made the director of the United States Army Air Force Physiological Research Unit in 1935, and in that year, this unit built one of the first human centrifuges in North America in an abandoned balloon hangar at Wright Field near Dayton, Ohio. You'll often hear that Dr. Franks's centrifuge in Toronto was the first in North America. It wasn't. There were a couple before it, although it was one of the most advanced and capable for many decades. But one of the first was this one at Wright Field. And Armstrong used this to conduct a series of tests where he started to demystify the process of G-LOC. And he found that for the average person, blackout started around 4.5 G, and once the acceleration was stopped, it took about 20 seconds for a person to recover, which was not good news for pilots because 20 seconds is a lot. You've probably augured into the ground by the time you've recovered your senses enough to pull out of a dive. And these experiments form the basis for a classic paper called Effects of Acceleration on the Living Organism, and this is later incorporated into his classic textbook in 1939, Principles and Practices of Aviation Medicine. Now, at the same time, another centrifuge was constructed at the Mayo Clinic, and Dr. Cecil Drinker and Philip Drinker of the Harvard School of Public Health started their series of experiments on G-LOC, and they made a number of important discoveries. One of them was that one of the effects of acceleration was to cause the heart to drop as much as 2 inches in the chest cavity. This might not seem a lot, but that's still another 2 inches that the heart needs to overcome to pump blood to the head. And they discovered that the application of a supporting garment, basically a girdle, helped with G resistance because it stopped the heart from dropping. They also developed what are known as G-strain maneuvers, which are still taught to fighter pilots today. And these are a series of exercises where the pilot, clenches the muscles in their legs and their abdomen, breathes very shallowly, and basically strains as many muscles as they can to force blood from the lower extremities back up to the core towards the heart. And like as I said, these are still used today, and they can increase a pilot's resistance to G by a considerable margin. But the first G suit, as we recognize it today, was developed by a gentleman named Lieutenant John R. or Jack Poppen. And Poppen had an interesting prior claim to fame. He was the person who developed the first modern version of the artificial horizon as we recognize it today. So when Sperry Gyroscope first came out with the artificial horizon, it was backwards from what we're used to, where the horizon stayed still and the little diagram of the aircraft actually tilted. And pilots found this endlessly confusing. Jimmy Doolittle complained about it, and Poppen insisted upon this doctrine where if you're going to be using a blind flying instrument, it should replicate as closely as possible the view outside of the cockpit. So he reversed the instrument and came up with the modern version where the aircraft symbol stays still and the horizon moves. And the device that he came up with for helping with acceleration, the Poppen Belt, was basically a cross between a blood pressure cuff and a girdle. And you can see this gentleman here very enthusiastically modeling it. And it was inflated, like a blood pressure cuff, using a little rubber bulb. And so you would have to know that you're going into a high G maneuver and inflate the belt before you started the maneuver. So not the most convenient thing to use. The problem in dogfights is that you don't know if you're going to be needing to react very quickly and pull a high G maneuver. So it really wasn't all that useful, but it was a step in the right direction. And interestingly enough, this belt is actually featured in the 1941 movie Dive Bomber with Errol Flynn, which is very interesting from an aerospace medicine point of view because they show a couple of developments at the time, including tests of early pressure suits for high-altitude flying. So it's worth checking out just for that little glimpse into the state of aerospace medicine at the time. So finally, we get to Dr. Wilbur Rounding Franks. Now, Franks was not actually involved in aerospace medicine prior to his work during the Second World War. He was actually a cancer researcher at the Banting and Best Institute at the University of Toronto. And during this research, he used a small benchtop centrifuge to separate out cell samples and things like that. And what he found was that the little test tubes he was using for this would often break under high G. And he discovered an interesting solution to this, which was to surround the test tubes in a larger container full of water. And the reason this works is because the water redistributes the pressure on the test tube, and thus it does not subject to as much unbalanced strain as it was before, and this prevents it from shattering. And when the Second World War broke out, and Dr. Franks heard about the problem of pilots blacking out, he thought that maybe this discovery could be used to solve the problem of G-LOC. And so he conducted an experiment where he immersed mice up to their necks in water using condoms and put them in the centrifuge. And he found that while immersed in water, they could handle up to an incredible 240 Gs of acceleration with no ill effect. And so he thought, okay, well, I just need to scale this up to human size. Now, you might recognize that this is not a very practical solution. You can't just fill the aircraft's cockpit with water or install a bathtub in place of the seat. But what Dr. Franks realized was due to a quirk of hydraulics, this is not actually necessary. So the pressure in a column of fluid is directly related to the height of that column and not its volume. Actually, this is a problem that's often posed to students first learning hydraulics. If you have, say, a hydroelectric dam and you reduce the volume of the reservoir behind it to just like a thin, say, centimeter-wide film adhering to the back of the dam, does the dam need to be as strong as it was before? And the answer is yes, because the pressure at the bottom of the dam is going to be the same because it's the height of the water column, not the volume that matters. And this is the principle that Dr. Franks applied to the G-suit, where in this diagram here, this is taken from an RCAF training film on the Franks suit. The bathtub of water is shrunk down to a thin layer of water clinging closely to the pilot's body. And the idea here is that under acceleration, the water will redistribute the pressure and compress the pilot's legs and abdomen, forcing blood automatically up into the chest. Now, interestingly enough, when Franks first presented his idea to the War Department, to the authorities, they rejected it. They weren't interested. G-Induced Loss of Consciousness was not seen as a big priority at the time. And the only reason he was able to proceed with building his first prototypes was thanks to an eccentric philanthropist named Harry McLean, who was rather infamous for throwing money around. He would just hand people thousands of dollars or throw $100 bills out the window of his hotel. And he gave Dr. Franks $5,000, which was a substantial sum in those days, so he could hire a seamstress and get the materials he needed to build his first prototype G-suits. And so he partnered up with the Dunlop Rubber Company and Dominion Textiles Limited and produced a series of prototypes. So as you can see here, this is Dr. Franks modeling the suit. It consisted of a very tight-fitting overall garment with an outer layer of non-stretch canvas and inner rubber bladders that held around 5 quarts or 5 liters of water. Now, in May of 1940, Franks took his prototype suits to Camp Borden and tested it out in a Fleet Finch training aircraft. And this was not only Dr. Franks' first time doing aerobatics, it was also his first time flying, period. So quite the baptism of fire. But the results spoke for themselves. They went up to 7 Gs, and Franks found that he was completely unaffected, whereas the pilot of the aircraft actually started blacking out. So, very promising. Unfortunately, there were some kinks to iron out. Dr. Franks found that under high acceleration, the pressure on his abdomen was so high that he thought that the suit was going to cut him in half. It was very uncomfortable. So he created a couple more prototypes, and these were tested a couple months later by RAF Wing Commander Darcy Grigg at Malton flying a Spitfire. And he also noted that it worked very well, but was also very, very uncomfortable at high accelerations. So this is again taken from that training film, and Dr. Franks features in this film. As you can see, the idea behind the use of this suit operationally was that you would wear it empty when you were on alert, and then you would climb into your aircraft, strap in, and then a ground crewman would come up with a big rubber bag full of water, connect it to a little hose at the top of the suit, and fill the suit with around 5 liters of water. And the training film gleefully says that, well, you can use this in all sorts of weather. If it's hot out, you can fill it with cold water. If it's cold out, you can fill it with hot water, like a hot water bottle, and you'll be fine. Although it fails to point out that eventually water temperature is going to equilibrate with the outside, and if it's hot out, you're going to have this big lukewarm mass of water around you, making you very hot and sweaty and uncomfortable. And during the winter, you're going to have this, again, layer of water wicking your body heat away. It also says that it's very useful as a source of potable water if you're shot down, failing to mention that the whole suit made you a full 18 pounds heavier and made it much likelier that you would just sink to the bottom of the ocean if you happened to ditch out at sea. So a couple of minor problems that they were very willing to gloss over. So in February 1941, Franks traveled to Farnborough, the aircraft research establishment in the UK, to conduct further tests. And interestingly enough, what you'll often hear is that Frederick Banting died in Newfoundland while flying across the Atlantic to join Dr. Franks to participate in this research. But according to the book Deadly Allies, which is about the program for biological and chemical weapons in Canada, apparently this was a cover story, and Banting was actually on his way to Porton Down, which was the biological and chemical weapons research facility in the UK, to participate in that research. Although given that the projects were highly classified, it's sort of up in the air what he was really there for. As you can see here, Dr. Franks performed a number of tests both in a Hawker Hurricane and in a ferry battle, which you can see him climbing into here. And once again, the results were encouraging. You can see in these frames at the bottom, he's pulling 5 Gs without the suit, and he's already pretty much passed out. And in the second one, he's wearing his suit, which he called the FFS, the Franks flying suit, pulling the same number of Gs, and he's just fine. However, Franks realized early on that doing these types of experiments in aircraft wasn't really the most scientific approach, because unless you have a really, really skilled aerobatic pilot, you're not going to be able to repeat the same G profiles over and over again, unless you're not going to be able to collect consistent data. So he decided for future research that he would construct instead a centrifuge, which he called an accelerator. And this was constructed at a site at Elkington Hunt Club, which the RCAF acquired in 1939, and where they established the #1 clinical investigation unit, which was later renamed the RCF Institute of Aviation Medicine. This was designed by engineer George A. Meek. It was built by the NRC and Victory Aircraft for $25,000 and was completed in the summer of 1941. And this was quite an advanced piece of equipment. It was situated in a concrete pit that was 12 feet deep and 31.5 feet in diameter. The arm was 8.5 feet long, and this was powered by a 200 horsepower electric motor, and it could accelerate up to 20 G in as little as 3 seconds. And so you can see the subject sat in this strange cab on the end of the arm, and that was actually on a universal joint. So when the arm swung around, the cab would actually swing up almost to the horizontal, and this would preserve the acceleration vector through the pilot's feet. And the seat inside could actually be tilted to any angle you wanted and could even be mounted upside down if you wanted to simulate negative G loads. and the operator sat in the middle and actually spun around with the test subject. And you can consider that to be kind of justice, since if you're going to be subjecting somebody to high G loads and making them pass out all the time, you might as well be willing to risk a little bit of motion sickness to do so. So the control of the centrifuge was quite interesting. Acceleration profiles were controlled by these little cam discs, which were sort of like, putting a record in a record player, where the outside profile of the disc gave you the profile of the run. So for example, on this one, you quickly accelerate to 4 Gs, maintain 4 Gs for 5 seconds, and then accelerate back down to 0. And you can cut these discs in any profile you want, and it allows you to do the same run over and over again very consistently and get consistent data. The cab itself was also heavily instrumented. You can see here in this photo of a test subject inside the cab. He's got a cinema camera facing him outside the cab to record his reactions to G loads. He's got an accelerometer beside him there, that little column device, and that's just a weight on a spring that extends under acceleration. There was also a system of buzzers and lights, and this was meant to gauge if the subject was conscious or not, or if he'd blacked out. If you responded to the sound but not the light, it meant you'd lost your vision. If you didn't respond to either, then that meant that you'd blacked out completely. And the subject answered using a switch on the control column. You can see they've replicated the same type of control column you would have on a Spitfire or a Hurricane. There were also some medical instruments, EKG, blood pressure monitor, and also an early version of what today we would call a pulse oximeter, which is a little optical device that clamps to the earlobe and shines light through the earlobe to gauge the oxygen level in the blood. So here's a nice view of the Hunt Club centrifuge, as well as a bunch of test subjects modeling the season's latest fashion, all the different prototype Franks G-suits. And this centrifuge was extremely successful. It actually performed by 1945 13,000 runs without any serious incidents. And the centrifuge was operated until 1987, when it was finally dismantled, and the cab and other various parts are now in the collection of the National Aviation Museum in Ottawa. Now, the result of all this testing was the production of the Franks Mk.III suit, which was the first G-suit to be tested in combat. And about 800 of these were produced, and they were first tested in February 1942 during the Operation Torch landings in North Africa. And they were tested by pilots of the Fleet Air Arm flying Seafires near Oran in Algeria. Unfortunately, they were not a hit. What Franks and a lot of the other G-suit pioneers didn't really realize or take into account was that by this point in the war, fighter pilots weren't really engaging in high-G maneuvers at all times. If they were escorting bombers, if they were performing air superiority patrols and things like that, all they were doing was flying straight and level for hours on end, and having this 18-pound rubber suit covering half your body got very, very uncomfortable after a while, and they just found that whatever acceleration protection that it afforded just wasn't worth the discomfort. And this would really be the story of the G-suit going forward until the late 1950s, when it was finally perfected, is pilots kept rejecting them, saying, no, these are too uncomfortable, these are too uncomfortable. And there was also the age-old problem of pilots being too proud to wear them, where they're like, well, no, I don't need this, I can take G-loads just fine. So that was a major disappointment. Now, near the end of the war, the RCAF also developed a number of alternative suits. These are the Franks Mk.IV and the Mk.VII, but that's a bit of a misnomer because Dr. Franks actually had very little to do with the design of these particular suits. They were developed by other departments and other engineers. And what's interesting about these is that these are actually air-filled suits. And this came about thanks to a rather embarrassing experiment that was conducted at the centrifuge at the Mayo Clinic, where researchers found that an ordinary Franks Mk.III suit, although it could provide you with 1.5 Gs of protection when filled with water, it could provide you with 2.2 Gs of protection when filled with air. And this really sounded the death knell for the water-filled Franks suit, and all operational flight suits ever since have been air-filled. And here you see another important development in the Franks Mk.IV here is the development of the cutaway suit. So as you can see, only those areas that have an air-inflated bladder are covered in cloth. All the other parts are cut away. And this makes the suit considerably lighter and also makes it possible to put the suit over top of ordinary flying clothing rather than underneath. And this was far more comfortable and convenient for most pilots. Now, as I said at the very beginning, it's rather strange that Dr. Franks is credited almost exclusively with the design of the G-suit, given that it was mostly others who were involved in the development of the modern technology, and also the fact that his approach using a water-filled suit had already been dismissed as unworkable 5 years before he began. In 1935, a group of German aviation scientists, including Dr. Siegfried Röff, Bertha Strughold, and Otto Gauer, came up with exactly the same idea of using water to protect pilots from acceleration. And they conducted a number of experiments and eventually came to the conclusion that this was not practical. It was too heavy and uncomfortable, and they abandoned that line of research. But you really can't blame Dr. Franks because it wasn't as if the Germans were freely exchanging scientific information with Canada in 1939 or 1940. Now, at about the same time, Dr. John Fulton, who was a famous American neurologist, came up with a similar idea of using inflatable leggings to prevent G-LOC. And a colleague of his, William K. Stewart, actually constructed a prototype of this device and took it to Farnborough for testing. And this was a full year before Dr. Franks arrived there. And he made an interesting encounter there that would eventually kickstart the American G-suit program, as we'll see later on. Now, another research program that was going on at around the same time as Dr. Franks was going on in Australia, headed by Dr. Frank S. Cotton. And Dr. Cotton was a world-renowned expert on cardiac output, and before the war, he conducted a series of experiments where he found that a great deal of acceleration protection could be afforded by submerging a test subject up to their heart level in water. Now, when the Second World War broke out, and especially the Battle of Britain, Dr. Cotton was following this in the newspapers and came across the problem of pilots passing out during high G maneuvers. And he thought that the principles he discovered before the war could be used to solve this problem. Unlike Dr. Franks, however, he immediately dismissed the idea of using water as impractical and went straight to air-inflated G-suits. And funnily enough, he constructed his first prototype using a woman's one-piece bathing suit mated to a pair of rubber boots, of wellies. And he tested this in a centrifuge that had been built by the Royal Australian Air Force at the University of Sydney and found that it worked exactly the way he designed it. And so he decided to take this suit on tour. He went to the UK, he went to Canada, he went to the United States, and he spoke to anybody he could find who was an expert on acceleration and aerospace medicine, including Dr. Franks. And he exchanged ideas before coming back to Australia and starting a full-scale research program. And so when he came back to Australia, he partnered up with two RAAF pilots, Flight Lieutenant Robert H. Thompson and Flight Lieutenant Ken V. Robertson, and put them through a number of tests of his prototype suits, both in the centrifuge at Sydney and in aircraft like a Hawk or Hurricane. And they found that the initial results were very promising. In fact, the pilots found that they could pull 10 G without any ill effect, and they actually damaged the aircraft that they were using, even though they suffered no ill effects at all. However, they did find a couple of problems. Like all early G-suits, it was very uncomfortable to wear, and it also prevented the leg straps from their parachutes from seating correctly. And Robertson is quoted as saying, "I am not yet convinced that one's matrimonial value will not drop to zero if one bails out wearing the suit." So there were some kinks to work out. So eventually, this concept was developed into what became known as the Cotton Aerodynamic Anti-G suit, or CAAG suit. And this is actually quite a sophisticated device. As I said, it was air-inflated. Actually, it was inflated from a cylinder of carbon dioxide with the inflation triggered by a special G-sensitive valve that would activate at around 1.5 G. But also, it had an advanced feature which was actually found in a lot of early G-suits, which was progressive inflation. So the idea was that it wouldn't inflate all at once. It would inflate first at the ankles and then up the thighs and then to the abdomen with a gradient of multiple pressures. And the idea here was to progressively milk the blood out of the legs into the abdomen and finally up to the heart. And these suits were first tested by P-40 pilots of the No. 2 Operational Training Unit in Mildura, Victoria. And then they became operational with No. 452 Squadron at Strauss Field in Darwin in July 1943. And these tests were inspired by an experiment that was done using a captured Japanese Zero fighter, where the RAAF found that the Spitfire could actually outturn the Zero, but the pilot would black out before it could do so. And so they were very interested in finding ways of making the pilots more resilient to G-force so that they could actually defeat the Zero. Now, as with the Franks suit, the main feedback from the pilots was this thing is ungodly uncomfortable. It's very hot and heavy, and if you can imagine the weather in Darwin, which is in northern Australia, especially when you're sitting on the airfield on alert for hours on end, you can see why they were complaining. But there was some help at hand. The McRobertson Confectionery Company, which was a huge company in Australia at the time, they funded the 1934 McRobertson Air Race from England to Melbourne. They actually provided a refrigerated van for the pilots to use as their ready room, and that provided a little bit of relief. Now, Cotton found that this initial progressive inflation system was just too complicated and heavy, and so the Mark I, which pilots called the Zoot suit, was simplified from a gradient of 16 pressures to the Kelly one-piece suit, which had only 5 pressures, and then the Mark II of the Kelly one-piece had only 3 pressures. But the most successful development program for G-suits was the American one. And as I said before, there was an interesting connection that led to this whole problem starting in the first place. So a gentleman named Frederick D. Mahler was actually at Farnborough at the same time as William K. Stewart, who was the associate of John Fulton, who was testing those pressurized leggings. And he saw this, thought it was an excellent idea, and went back and spoke to a firm called Berger Brothers and asked them to develop a more sophisticated suit. And they submitted this to the U.S. Army Air Force as the G-1. And this thing was considerably lighter than previous designs. It was air inflated, it weighed around 10 pounds, and had 17 bladders in 3 different inflation zones, and like a lot of these early suits, inflated progressively from the ankles upwards. And this was tested at the Mayo Clinic Centrifuge, and you can see the cab right there. Now, unlike the Cotton suit, this was not inflated from a compressed air bottle, but rather from an engine-driven pump on fighter aircraft that also supplied vacuum pressure to the instruments and de-icing boots and things like that. Unfortunately, there were some problems with this. Number one, because of reducing air pressure, this meant that the pump and the suit didn't work above 30,000 feet. The air was just too thin to inflate the suit. And also, the pump wasn't powerful enough to inflate the suit adequately from zero pressure. So it actually had to be kept inflated at around 0.8 psi at all times, and then it inflated to full pressure from there when it was needed. And pilots really didn't like that because it changed the feel of the rudder pedals and made the aircraft a lot harder to control. Nonetheless, a couple were adopted by the US Navy, and they were first tested in combat in Palau in 1944 by the VF-8 Ghost Cat Hellcat Squadron operating off USS Bunker Hill. And as with all the other tests, they said, yeah, it works, but it's far too uncomfortable for what we need it for. So Berger Brothers simplified the design. They went to the G2, which had 5 bladders instead of 17, and it weighed only 6.5 pounds. And this provided around 1.4 G of protection. And thankfully, by this time, they figured out a way of making it inflate from completely deflated rather than having to keep it inflated at 0.8 psi all the time. Now, Berger Brothers had a competitor in the form of the David Clark Company. So David Clark had founded a knitting business, and he made a lot of money off of a support garment called the straightaway, which used a proprietary stitch that he had invented. And in 1940, he looked at all the problems plaguing US forces and decided that he would try to develop his own G-suit. So he came up with something that was very similar to the Poppen Belt. And before he could actually pitch this to the Army Air Force, by remarkable coincidence, he managed to run into Jack Poppen. And Poppen told him, he's like, yeah, I already tried that. You're going to want to make an automatic valve because no pilot is going to want to mess around with inflating his suit manually. So David Clark went back, he created an automatic valve for inflating his suit, and then pitched it again to the Army Air Force. Unfortunately, they said that they were not interested because the Berger Brothers suit was already in limited production. They said, well, we already have something that works, it's already in production, sorry. Undeterred, David Clark went back and he created what he called the Progressive Arterial Occlusion Suit, which could provide up to 3 Gs of protection. And this was also another one of those progressive inflation suits that inflated progressively from 20 psi at the ankles all the way up to 1.25 psi at the abdomen. Unfortunately, he found that this had some side effects. It was, again, heavy and uncomfortable, and it also caused petechia. It caused bruising under the skin. So he modified this. He got rid of the progressive inflation valve, which was big, cumbersome, and complicated anyway, and he created something called the arterial occlusion suit, or AOS. And this inflated all at once, and the effect was basically like a tourniquet. And he found that it provided just as much protection as the previous suit, but it was a lot simpler to build and a lot lighter and a lot cheaper. So he presented this once again to the Army Air Force, and once again they said no. Yes, this provides twice as much protection as the Berger Brothers suit, but Berger Brothers suit is already in production. We're fine. So again, undeterred, overnight goes and redesigns the suit. And this is the clever bit. What he does is he adds a bunch of pockets for like carrying a survival knife and parts of a survival kit and cigarette packages and things like that. He makes it into a more utilitarian combat garment. And finally, he presents this again to the Army Air Force, and finally they're interested. And eventually they would adopt both the Berger Brothers and the David Clark suits, and they would standardize on one design, only with a number of differences. For example, Berger Brothers used rubber in their bladders, whereas the David Clark suits used rubberized nylon. And eventually, the David Clark Company suits turned out to be the more reliable, the more robust, the more effective, and they ended up being the main supplier of suits to the Air Force post-war. And a couple of innovations that they came up with at the same time, one of the most important was the valve. So the earlier valves that previous inventors had come up with were pretty cumbersome. They were big, heavy, complicated, and they weren't that sensitive. So the pilot would sometimes pass out before the suit had even inflated. And this was finally solved by a Mr. Richard Cornelius out of Minneapolis, who came up with a highly sensitive valve called the Cornelius valve. And this became standard equipment on a lot of US fighter aircraft, both at the end of the war and after the war. And the idea was that since it was standard equipment, you didn't need to install any special equipment. If you had a compatible G suit, you just popped into the cockpit, plugged in your air hose, and off you went. And a remarkable improvement in performance was had after the war with the advent of jet engines, because a jet engine has limitless amounts of bleed air for you to use to inflate your suit, rather than this relatively weak engine-driven pump that the piston engine fighters had. And the photo that you see at the bottom there, those are the molds for creating the bladders. And so one of the refinements that David Clark made was to cast all of their bladders and the channels between them in one piece. And this made their suits a lot cheaper and easier to make. And here are some of the late war standard G suits, the Z2 and the G-3A. And you can see the G-3A is a cutaway style, and this would be standard going into the jet age and still is today. And you can imagine, to Dr. Franks' chagrin, these are the types of suits that the Royal Canadian Air Force would adopt immediately after the war, American suits. But Dr. Franks was vindicated in a way on several fronts. So this rather medieval-looking device here is called the Iron Maiden, and this was the brainchild of a researcher known as R. Flanagan Gray. And this was for testing to see if total immersion in water could really provide all that much G protection. And Gray mounted this to the Centrifuge at the Johnsville, Pennsylvania Naval Air Development Center, and on December 7th, 1958, he rode this thing to a whopping 32 Gs, which he sustained for 25 seconds. And this is made all the more impressive by the fact that in the patent drawing you see a breathing hose. He didn't have that. He was holding his breath the entire time. Now, some of you are probably going to think, well, Colonel John Stapp sustained more acceleration than that, but that was momentary, instantaneous acceleration. He didn't sustain it for a full 25 seconds like Gray did, and Gray's record still stands to this day. And he actually could have gone higher, because this is the centrifuge at Johnsville. It's called the Wheel, and this was used to train astronauts for the Mercury and Apollo programs. And the cab for the subject, as you can see, is in this weird oblong spheroid at the end here. And the Iron Maiden just didn't fit in there, so you had to mount it farther inwards towards the hub of the centrifuge. And whereas the outside of the centrifuge could reach 40 Gs, the only place you could mount the Iron Maiden only reached up to 32 Gs. Still quite an accomplishment. And you'll notice, as in most centrifuges, the operator is not seated in the middle spinning around with the subject, but is safely in that little control room up at the top there. Now, the other way in which these early pioneers were vindicated is in the return of a lot of these principles that were initially abandoned in the early days of G-suit development. And one of those is progressive inflation. On the left here, you'll see the retrograde inflation anti-G suit, or REAGs, and this was developed in the 90s by the David Clark Company for the US Air Force, and this was just a reimagining of the progressive arterial occlusion suit that David Clark has started out with, where it inflates progressively from the ankles up to the abdomen in order to milk the blood out of the legs. Unfortunately, it was found to be not that much more effective than the regular G suits that the US Air Force had, and they didn't accept it. Other advancements to G-suits have been the addition of a bladder on the chest, and this is for help in pressure breathing. So when you're flying at high altitude at low pressures, you can increase the altitude you can reach by breathing oxygen at high pressure, but the problem is it makes it very hard to exhale. So this pressure breathing bladder applies pressure to the chest and allows you to exhale forcefully and pressure breathe at high altitudes. But perhaps the greatest vindication of Franks's early research is probably the development of the Lebel G Multiplus suit in Germany. And this is essentially a modern version of the Franks flying suit, the liquid-filled suit. So this uses a version of a technology called capstans, which was developed for use in pressure suits early in the jet age. And the idea in a capstan suit is that you had these long rubber tubes that stretched down along the legs, along the arms, and up the back. And these were attached to interdigitating laces called capstans that wrapped around the arms and legs. And when you were in a low pressure environment, you would inflate the tubes, and the tubes would pull on the capstans and apply even pressure to the entire body so that it could resist low pressure environments. This is similar, only those tubes are filled not with air, but with water. And it works exactly the same way as the original Franks suit. Under acceleration, the water increases in pressure, the tubes inflate, and they pull on the capstans and provide pressure to the legs and the abdomen to stop the pilot from passing out. And the advantage of this is that unlike all other G-suits, which have to be plugged into the aircraft and have an air supply which can fail, this is completely independent of the aircraft. You can hop into any aircraft you want wearing this, and it will act automatically. So the principle was sound, it just needed a little bit more development. And this is essentially the state of G-suits today. All right, I'm going to pass it off to James Poplow, who can talk about this photo of him and a couple of other gentlemen with Dr. Franks. And then we will open the floor to questions, and he can provide us with some of his expertise. Take it away, James.
Thank you, Jill. That was remarkable. The research and the preparation of those slides and the history and your narration was remarkable. Thank you for doing that.
You're very welcome.
On the left, this young guy, because this is 1984, was moi, and the rest of these are Canadian CAHS, the Canadian Aerodynamics and Space Institute. And this chap is a retired Surgeon General, Major General Dupuy. And this is Dr. Franks. And if you just remember what he looked like in 1940, 39, 40, his mustache, his eyes, yes, he had cataract lenses in his glasses, but he was a very bright and inquiring person. And we presented him in 1984 with the Canadian Aeronautics and Space Institute Award. Dr. Franks received many awards over the years, from OBE, of course, to the Airspace Medicine medals, 2 different ones. But he was always appreciative, and he knew what was going on, and he could watch this history that you just heard from Gilles carry on, first feeling like his water-filled suit wasn't going to be practical, to the very end with those Lebel water tubes, where it showed that it actually did work. It just didn't need to be as much water, if I can put it lightly. He was a wonderful man, and it was tough on all of us when he passed away in 1986. And I was, as I mentioned at the opening of the talk, I was the Director of Medical Life Support Division at DCIM in Toronto, where that arm was originated, although it was actually built in the old Avenue Road site. We built a new one in the building in which I worked, and I have ridden in both of them. And so the history, if you like, of the G-suit and the history of the acceleration arm go together. We could not have done it without them. And all of that research was constrained, as Gilles mentioned, in 1939, 1940. Dr. Franks may have known about the German research in 1935, 36, 37. He may have known about the American and Australian, but it's not clear that he did because, of course, it was all top secret at the time. And although there was sharing between what we now call the Five Eyes or the Five Intelligence Institutes, I doubt that all of that was shared that quickly. But Dr. Franks lived long enough to realize that his original research did result in both air pressure suits and in water-filled horizontal Labelle tubes. So good for him, and what a great talk. Thank you, Gilles.
I'm going to go back to the question page and open up the floor to James or myself. You might want to pick James's brain for his medical expertise, and his expertise is specifically on Dr. Franks, as I only covered a very narrow slice of Franks's work and life. Anyways.
Not a question, Gilles. Just want to say you've done your usual outstanding job of research and preparation, and great presentation.
Thank you.
Just while we wait, that fellow sitting at the bottom in what looks like an F-18 cockpit is Lieutenant Colonel retired Gary Hook, who in fact is the thousands of hours of CF-104 and CF-18, and I would be surprised if Gary doesn't come up with something just to see if he can fool me.
Yeah, challenge, Jim.
Thank you, Gary.
I'd just like to echo Jim's comments, Gilles. Very much enjoyed the presentation. Having spent many hours in G suits, a historical trip back and learning something of the genesis was fascinating. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Just a bit on my background. Having lived the joys of 9G in both the F-16 and the Dutch Centrifuge, having experienced G-Loss of Consciousness and the Tudor and the CF-18, and spent way too much time in the Centrifuge in Toronto at both DCIM and Avenue Road. It was quite a lifestyle for many years. The one comment I would like to make, and if I heard correctly, when you were talking about the anti-G straining maneuver, of where tightening the both the thighs, the abdomen, and as well as closing down the throat. And this is my claim to fame, where they named the maneuver after me. Because when you're doing the anti-G straining maneuver,
oh yeah, you say hook, yeah.
They want you. So there's my claim. So Frank, step aside. Everybody's talking about me, not you. So, Harvard. On a serious note, the anti-G straining maneuver is a preventive measure. If I heard you correctly, you'd suggested it's to return the blood flow. It cannot do that.
No,
What we have to do when the onset of G is coming on is, before you get to that critical point, is you have to be anticipating. So it's an anticipatory move. If you get behind the curve, it's like dehydration. You just can't catch up.
Well, it probably makes it worse.
Well, it doesn't make it worse, but once you get behind, you're struggling and you're trying there, and the only way out is to relax the back pressure to get the G load off. But the critical thing is those first few seconds, and while sustained 7G will definitely knock you out, it's that initial nose rate of onset of G. In other words, how quickly we can get the G forces on, that can lead to real problems. And as I said, I've experienced a G-LOC in the F-18 with the G suit, and just not being ready for that tremendous onset, which we can do in modern day aircraft.
No, it was not my intention to suggest that it would, you used it during the onset of G. It is a preventative measure. And it was just like with the earlier G suits, where the G suit would start working at 1.5 G, like just as soon as you started pulling Gs, and it would start inflating almost immediately as a preventative measure. It was sort of the biological analog to that.
Right.
Yes.
Have you ever done any research on for example, the P-39 pilots in the Pacific Theater, where they were taping their thighs with what we would refer to duct tape nowadays, before going up to go head to head with the Zeros? They would use what we would call duct tape to really strap down their thighs to give them that extra G protection.
Oh yeah, they tried all sorts of things. Actually, something I failed to mention is that at the end of the Second World War, a lot of the pilots were only convinced to use G suits. They found them very uncomfortable when somebody showed them the statistics that their kill rate doubled when they wore them. And that was the thing that finally appealed to the fighter pilots, where they're like, okay, yes, it's uncomfortable, but hey, I get to kill twice as many of the enemy. So yeah, that's good. So that's finally what they showed them that finally convinced them to give it a shot.
Gilles, this might be a kind of, I don't know, myth, but Douglas Bader had 10 legs.
Yeah.
And flew in combat and was apparently able to pull high Gs, possibly because he didn't have to worry about the blood flowing into the extremities. He didn't have that many extremities.
I would say that's plausible. James can probably comment on that. Although this one thing also I didn't include in the presentation is one of the interim solutions to G-LOC that they came up with before the advent of the G-suit was pedals that were higher than the normal rudder pedals. And you would put your feet up on these things, sort of like, OBGYN stirrups, and it would raise your legs higher towards your heart. And you would do that temporarily when pulling a high G maneuver, and it would help with your G resistance. So I would think probably plausible if you had no legs, there would be less places for the blood to go. James, what's your take on that?
I have heard that. I have read about Vader, and yes, it's true. He felt that he had more G tolerance because of the missing legs, but he may also have had more tolerance because he had a lot more experience, and he was talking to young guys.
James, a question for you. The RAF experimented with prone pilots. They actually put a Gloucester Meteor together with a prone pilot section in the front of it. Was that also to eliminate some of the G forces when you're lying down?
I can actually answer that one. Yes, that was exactly what they were looking at. And the Germans had actually done a couple of studies near the end of the war. They were looking at like very lightweight rocket fighters for taking down Allied bombers. And they had them with the pilot prone, not just to reduce the G load, but also to reduce the cross-sectional area of the aircraft to make it a harder target. And yeah, the British had this Gloucester Meteor with this cockpit in the front, but they found that it was not practical because, yes, it did increase your resistance to G load, but A, you couldn't look behind you because you were prone. It was very difficult to engage in a dogfight like that. And number two, it was a death trap if you ever encountered problems, because in order to bail out, you had to jettison the front landing gear and then sort of shuffle backwards, release your rudder pedals, and then fall backwards through this hatch behind you. And, if you're spiraling out of the sky, that's not going to happen. They couldn't really build an effective ejection seat for that. So they abandoned that, and the G-suit sort of took care of that problem.